Thanks, Richard. So it's great to see a good crowd here. For those who don't know me, my name is Keith Edwards. I'm the director of the GVU Center, which I'll say just a couple of words about before we get into our talks. But if the Georgia Tech people look around, you may see some faces you're not familiar with. We're very, very pleased to have visiting with us today our admitted Masters in HCI students. So I'd like to welcome you all. If you don't mind, please just stand up so we can see who's who. Please. Thank you. Welcome. We hope you're having a great visit to Georgia Tech. This activity, the GVU Brown Bag, is something that we do every week. We have a variety of internal and external speakers, really great talks, free lunch every week, and I hope that you'll make this a regular part of your weekly schedule when you come to Georgia Tech. So what is GVU? GVU is basically a university-wide interdisciplinary research center that's focused on kind of everything at the intersection of computing and people. So a lot of the same things that you guys are interested in. And we do a lot of work to try to support the work that you do. So we provide an interface to industry. We try to build research partnerships and collaborations with industry partners. We work on getting you all internships at amazing places. And we do a lot more too. We provide travel grants for students to go to conferences. We have a really cool prototyping lab that's a makerspace in the basement of this building. Hopefully you'll get a chance to see it while you're here. Usability lab, mobile app development lab, kind of a lot of stuff like that. So please get involved with GVU when you come to Georgia Tech. What we're doing at today's talk is we're giving a really quick overview of some of the research that Georgia Tech will be presenting at the CHI conference. As you know, CHI is kind of one of the main conferences, probably the main conference in the field of HCI. We always have a really good showing at CHI, and this year is no different. We have 13 accepted papers and notes from Georgia Tech. That includes 5 honorable mention award papers, plus participation in numerous other venues. If you happen to be going at CHI, we have our regular reception, which will be on the Tuesday of the conference. It's a big party at the International COEX, so it should be a really great time. Please feel free to swing by. Really quickly, I don't expect you to read all this, but this is the set of 13 papers and notes from Georgia Tech that were accepted. Due to travel and conflicts, we're not able to hear about all of these today, but we will hear from the 4 that are highlighted here. And I am not sure who is going first, but we're going to keep you guys on a quick timetable. Who's first? Catherine?
Got a question?
Yes. Graphics, Visualization, and Usability Center. But we do a lot more than that now, so we don't typically kind of expand that acronym.
What does IBM stand for? Think of it more like that. It's more just...
Just a term.
The letter.
I'm using this.
Yeah, but it's not, that's not what it means.
Hi, everyone. I'm Catherine Grevet. I am a PhD student here in the Comp Social Lab. My advisor is Gilbert. And I'll be presenting a new prototyping technique called Piggyback Prototyping for large-scale social systems. So I started off this project wanting to look at some social theory problems, and to do that, I was imagining building this app where I would have people in airports trying to connect with others who are very different from them. And so I'm sort of skimming over the specific social theory questions I'd be looking at here, and instead thinking about this problem of building an app to connect people to meet face-to-face. So here's a little scenario. You know, someone's flight is delayed, and they want to talk to someone, spend the time meeting a new person, and they would check their app to try to find a travel buddy. So to get launched on this research project, I would need to build the app, and then get 2 people to use the app and meet up. And then to be able to answer my social theory research, I would need many people to use the app all at once, meeting each other. And basically at that point, I would have created pretty much a startup with a fully functional app with people using it simultaneously all across the country. And you can imagine all the engineering that would go behind this. I would have to build up all the server spaces. I would have to create all the user accounts, build a robust front-end app, And I would need to get enough of a marketing push so that this would go viral and everyone would want to use it. And then finally, I would be able to collect the data I need to answer my research question. So you can see that this is not really feasible at the level of a researcher or for me as a grad student here. And did I really need to build this full app just to test those research questions? And of course, this is what prototyping solves for us as HDI researchers. We prototype a project or a tool before we create the fully functional one, so we can iterate and adapt it to it based on the findings that we see through user testing and looking at different angles of it. So to walk through a little bit of the history of prototyping in HCI, paper prototyping is a low fidelity, very common way to prototype an interface where you could print out the website or the app and have people walk through the navigation of it or see, specific angles you're interested in. Another very common one is Wizard of Ozing, where you would have someone sitting behind a screen and people could interact with somewhat of an interactive interface, but instead of building the fully fledged back end, you would have little elves running in the back and doing the work for you. You could also prototype using 3D printing or more of the visual design side, where you'd want to see the form factor and how things feel in people's hands, or what people see when they first go on a splash page or something like that. And then a very common one for us too is using interactive and higher fidelity prototypes. So looking at how buttons click and what happens when users expect a different screen to appear. But turning to social computing research, we don't have any way of prototyping critical mass, or that problem of seeing what would happen in a system where you would need many people to use it in order to determine anything about what the system is. Like, imagine prototyping Facebook before Facebook even existed. So piggyback prototyping is the first technique of this sort to address the problem of obtaining critical mass without having to go out and build a full system from scratch. So to walk you through the different phases, it's a 6-phase technique that has 2 iterative phases. So first of all, you would want to devise your design goals. So here, the critical part is really to figure out what type of target population you're looking at and to define those research questions you're interested in. Then you would choose an existing site that has either an available API or that's at least pretty easy to scrape data from. And here you'd want some sort of a social API, so a place where people have maybe profiles or where people are interacting with each other. Then you would want to gauge the critical mass for your specific research question based on your target population. And this is iterative in that if you don't have enough critical mass on the platform you were expecting or with the population you were thinking of, then you would go back and refine what that population is and what the site is that you're looking at. Then the next phase is to build the prototype. So this is where there's a significant amount of coding involved. You could build, say, a social algorithm to see how you would want to pair different people. You could be prototyping the message that you send to pair people, maybe what you would tell about each person before they actually meet. Then you would want to deploy the prototype and manage it as it's being as it's happening live on the system. And here it's really important also to follow ethical standards, as in you would be doing human subjects research, so involving the IRB in this process is really important. And then finally, you would collect feedback and metrics and determine whether the prototype was successful or not, and determine the lessons learned from it to then go back and refine it. Perhaps go back and refine the specific prototype, or figure out, okay, this was successful enough, we'll build the fully fledged app based on what we learned here. So it's pretty high level. To give you a more concrete example of what we did, going back to the airport problem of creating a social app to connect people who are different from each other in airports, my design goal was seeing if people would use this type of an app to meet a stranger. Then the existing site that I chose was Twitter, because people check into locations on Twitter, and there's also a pretty readily available user profile for the different Twitter users. To gauge critical mass, I sent a survey to people who met our target population on Twitter. And in the survey, I asked, would you use an app like this? Did you meet anyone today in the airport? And some basic demographic information. And part of that was to get if, people would be interested. But another big part was to see if we had enough people checked into different airports within a close enough amount of time. So looking at this, we saw about 2 people checked into the top 10 most busy airports in the US within about 15 minutes of each other, which was good enough for us to get those people to perhaps meet face-to-face. Then we built our prototype on top of Twitter. So we were scraping Twitter for check-ins to airports, and then all the people who had checked in to that airport, we compared their profiles based on a number of different similarity metrics, and paired up people who were the most different from each other, and sent them a follow-up message saying, hey, you guys are both checked into this airport, you should meet up. Then as we managed the prototype, so we sent the tweets out, we let this sort of run in the back end, but also monitored it pretty closely, just checking to see what replies we were getting back, and especially controlling for if anyone had an issue or if there were any questions raised based on it. So it's not, you wouldn't send this to millions of people and expect it to be that scalable, but at least to the level where, you can reply to tweets and make sure that everyone in the study is doing okay. And then finally, we sent a follow-up survey. So the day after people were paired, they got a survey asking either if you met questions about that meeting, or if you didn't meet, would you like to be paired up again, and just some more general comments. And we also analyzed the replies we got and some like who favorited tweets and that type of stuff. Here's an example of our live prototype. So this is what it would look like when we'd send a tweet. We'd say, so-and-so and so-and-so, you're both at whatever airport. Why don't you meet before your planes take off? And as you can see, the second tweet is a direct follow-up with a link to our study IRB protocol, and just some basic information about the study. And then the conversations would often go like this, they would tweet, oh, this is awesome, Jane, where are you? And then tweeting out their gate information. And then this happened pretty often, oh, I just boarded my flight, or sorry, I can't meet up. But it was really cool to see these types of interactions happening and people having that type of a positive feel towards it. So one of our big questions that we were really curious about is, would people actually meet up from this little simple Twitter bot? And it turned out that people did. We saw 8 people meet face-to-face, which was 4 pairs. And this is not really enough data yet to say anything about the social theory behind this, but it was really cool to just see that our prototype was successful in pairing up people. And then in the follow-up survey, I also saw that 53% of the respondents would like to be paired up just on this basic Twitter bot again with someone who also checked into the airport. So we thought that was pretty cool. And then the other thing that we wanted to know is why people didn't meet up. Was it because they just hated this idea, or something else that we could perhaps incorporate in the next iteration of the prototype? And the top reasons people didn't meet up was because they either saw the tweet too late, or they just were not expecting it. They were too far from each other. They didn't have enough time before their flight. They were not traveling, so like people who work in the airport just sort of tweeting on the job. Or they were arriving instead of departing. And then there's one more of the top ones that was for social reasons, which was like people traveling with their family or whatever, which would be hard to incorporate into the prototype. But all of these reasons could be better accounted for if we created an opt-in system where people would sign up and know to expect to be receiving that message connecting them to someone else. If we could better manage for how much time they have and the specific location they're in the airport, we expect that we would see many more meetups and perhaps be able to collect a lot more data. So that's piggyback prototyping, and we have some examples in the paper of other types of systems you could envision using this technique for. For example, if you were OkCupid and you wanted to create a new social matching algorithm, you could prototype that algorithm with something like piggyback prototyping. If you wanted to do something like a collaborative translation site, sort of like Duolingo, you could find people on Twitter who speak 2 languages or who tweet in 2 languages, and then send them a message asking them to translate a specific sentence or a paragraph and doing it together, and then seeing what social interactions happened around that. So we hope that piggyback prototyping can inspire other projects that would be really interesting to do, but really hard to do right now because of the critical mass issue. And especially for researchers and people, and especially grad students, who might not have the time to embark on this very risky and long-term project, but just need to answer some really interesting research questions. Thank you.
Time for a couple of questions while the next talk gets set up.
Yep.
So this seems like it would be really challenging to try to get IRB approval for. How difficult was that to get this on?
So we had a lot of back and forth with the IRB, and it actually ended up not being so bad. We did a waiver of consent. And the other nice part about doing it in airports is that it's very easy to argue for ensuring safety and minimal risk. So finding those features about the study, this doesn't have to be used for people meeting face to face. It could just be a web interaction. So then the risk would be even lower, but IRB was okay. Yeah. Yep.
So I noticed at the beginning of the presentation that a picture talked about how you're trying to incorporate claim voice. Is there a reason why you try to incorporate that in
that was more of a scenario for thinking through someone who would be in the airport, what situation would they be in when they would want to use this app. Yeah, I mean, I guess like if you wanted to push out the app as an app and market it as something you can use while your flight is delayed, could be something, but it didn't really come up in the surveys. Yeah. Oh, and the other thing is, what would be really cool is if you could find people on Twitter whose flight is delayed. In that case, pair those people up and perhaps get a much higher chance of getting those people connected. But that was really hard to do. Gregory?
What's the gap between using Twitter as a prototyping platform for this kind of application and just using it plain as the deployment platform for these kinds of applications?
Yeah, so you mean like instead of calling this a prototype, calling this the full app? Yeah, I think like to answer some of the research questions, you could see it that way. Like for me to answer the social theory stuff I wanted, I could get enough people connected through my prototype.
Even thinking as a developer, why not just say, I'm going to build all my social apps on Twitter?
Yeah, I think then there's also a risk of, what Twitter users, like what how the norms would change on Twitter, because people would expect that they'll be getting all this spam and all these requests for being on Twitter, which is definitely like a potential issue with this, is if everyone did this all the time, Twitter would change in terms of its nature. So, yeah. It would be different, yeah. But as a researcher, we don't expect there would be that many research projects doing this. And Twitter bots currently exist. I mean, some systems already do that.
So when you're connecting people in the same location, would it be a viable possibility to look at, analyze the kinds of tweets they have or the people that they follow, to list if there is any common theme that they share so that it prompts them to interact more with each other, to participate, or is that not, would that be
Yeah, so that's sort of what we did actually. We would take the profiles and we have a similarity comparison algorithm to connect to profiles. So we would look at like the content of the links that they post, the people they follow, their followers, the language level they use, stuff like that. And Twitter doesn't ask for age or gender, but you can compare people's names to census data and sort of get at that. Yep.
Hi, I'm Christina Masden, and today I'm going to be talking about understanding the role of community in online dating. So how are people understanding how to use online dating websites and systems? And today I'm not only going to be talking about online dating and community, but what these things sort of gave us as an insight into understanding systems design and online dating in general. So we set out to investigate how people are understanding how to use online dating systems, and during the study we found that community interaction can play an important role in many ways. But to sort of talk a little bit more about this, what's different about online dating systems and sites versus other online communities? So imagine you're using an online dating system to find love. And this particular screenshot is from OkCupid, but most online dating systems will look generally like this. A profile with information about the individual and not much else. So you'll find Alice and you read her profile and you look at her pictures, and maybe you think you'd like to get to know her a little bit better. And the only real way to do this is to send a message. And so that might be fine, because maybe Alice likes you as well, and you plan a date to meet up offline. But maybe she doesn't like you, and she just stops talking. Or maybe she sends a message that makes you uncomfortable. Or maybe she just never responds. And then that's it. You have no way of knowing if what you did was the cause of her lack of response. And maybe your initial message wasn't great, and maybe your profile was poor. And maybe she just gets so many messages that she'll end up responding back a few months later when you've already moved on and met the love of your life elsewhere. But there's really no way of knowing, and it's impossible for you to compare your interactions to that of others. And contrast that with something like Facebook, where your comments and conversations can be public for all. And maybe your comment wasn't great, but you can see how others are interacting with other comments, and that's a frame of reference that you don't get with online dating. So moving on to talking a little bit more about what we already know about online dating. We know a fair bit about how people use current systems and their behaviors in the sites. And to touch on the points, deception is prevalent, and about over half of users lie about something tangible and measurable, like height or weight. And we also know that people like to ask for help when constructing their profiles. And finally, we know that people care a lot about presentation of themselves and impression management. But what don't we know about online dating systems as communities? There's some really big differences. Members of online dating systems don't have ways to observe the behavior of others or to be corrected by members of the community. And all interactions are didactic, meaning that the only people who can see a conversation are those that are currently in the conversation, like you and Alice. But with more traditional online communities, we know that newcomers become experienced members through things like legitimate peripheral participation. This involves observation and practice. We also know that feedback and observation normalizes participation standards on social media, and this is chiefly through moderation feedback and replies to comments. But again, on online dating websites, the only feedback users get are from those parties they have a private conversation with. So there's absolutely no way to be corrected by community members or to observe the interactions of community members. So with these in mind, this leads to the research questions we had when going into this work. First, we're interested in how a didactic interaction system plays a part in shaping behavior. And more broadly, how do users understand how to behave on a website if they're given limited feedback? How do they understand how to behave? It's difficult. Second, we wanted to know if social practices and norms existed on online dating websites, and if so, how they were established considering that lack of feedback and visibility. So how do users understand what's acceptable and what isn't? How do they understand what to do? And third, what aspects of online dating are currently problematic for users? And what opportunities for design might exist? We wanted to investigate spaces for new online dating designs, and we knew that things like harassment seemed to be prevalent because interactions were chiefly hidden, but we wondered if there was more. And we wanted to know how the design choice of didactic interactions might lend itself to issues. So we wanted to investigate further. And in order to sort of get at these questions, we decided to look at two very different online dating systems. The first one was OkCupid, which was launched in 2004, and it's a matching-based online dating system. So profiles are complete with text, photographs, and a match percentage, and this sort of compares the compatibility of two users. This is the primary way that a user can select a potential romantic partner, and users are free to message anybody that they wish. So there's sort of a complex matching algorithm, there's unrestricted messaging, the profiles are extensive, and you can search for people. And this is what OkCupid looks like. So you can see on the right, under My Details, there's matching information, height, body type, etc. There's photographs, and there's a long detailed profile. So to compare OkCupid with a different system, we chose Tinder, which is very different. And Tinder was launched in 2012, and it's a location-based phone application. And profiles have photographs and a very short list of personal information. So that people do have profiles, but it's not anywhere near the extent that they do on OkCupid. And finally, Tinder is connected to a user's Facebook profile, and it shows friends in common, which OkCupid does, and it's not connected socially in that regard. And the way that Tinder works for their matching algorithm and their messaging is like this. So if users, this is what the Tinder app looks like. And users can either swipe left to sort of say that they are not interested in someone, and then their profile goes away forever and they can't message them. Or they can swipe right. And if they swipe right, then they can wait to see if that user swipes right on them. And then they can start messaging. So essentially the messaging is restricted by both people and both parties saying that they're interested in talking to the other. But it was very hard to sort of get participants and sort of figure out how to recruit people to sort of compare and talk about their experiences on these websites. So while we were trying to sort of figure out a way to recruit people to give us a little bit more insight, we started looking at sort of some alternative ways. And while we were investigating these ways to answer the research questions, we noted that Reddit, which is a text-based forum website with many smaller forums called subreddits, there were a lot of places where people were discussing online dating. And they were discussing the exact issues we were interested in super rich detail on many, many subreddits, so those smaller forums. And we also noted that there were 2 subreddits that matched up pretty well. And they were very, very active. Highly active, and people were discussing these issues very in depth. So we sort of observed for a little while, and in order to sort of answer these questions, what we did is we recruited 9 participants who had participated in these subreddits, all of whom were either former or current OkCupid users, and 5 were current or former Tinder users. And we administered demographic surveys and conducted semi-structured interviews of around 30 to 60 minutes, and conducted inductive thematic analysis in the transcriptions. And I should also mention that, sorry, my notes are a little. And we had an observation period for around 4 months beforehand, which gave us a lot of information for our targeted interview and also was incorporated into the paper. So I'll talk a little bit more about the findings now. And I'm just going to go ahead and jump into the first one, which is the role of online community. So we learned a lot about how users understand the systems through discussion of features, and that people want to discuss dating. There's a need for online community. And finally, that people were understanding the sort of norms on these systems. So first, let's introduce a user who turned to the subreddits when he was very frustrated with the online dating system. And he says, I posted for help asking once because I was so frustrated. That was the day I genuinely gave up on Tinder because I had just been liking everything for hours and hours and hours and just nothing. And this is very typical. People would get frustrated and not know where to turn, and then they would seek out a place to sort of discuss these issues and figure out what was going on. And users will also, on the subreddits, users would often post profiles for critique on these forums, and many users described using this to their advantage, not just to get critique on their own profiles, but to sort of glean information about what others were doing right or wrong from their posted profiles and the discussions surrounding them. So one user, he sort of references a discussion around profiles that are being posted, and he says, it's a good indication of what not to type to women online, and it's a good reference to keeping your head in the game. Luckily, I haven't been doing any of those mistakes. And people would do this quite a lot. They would, since they weren't able to sort of look at other users of the same sort of sexual orientation and gender very easily, they would use the forums to sort of get a better understanding of those people. So this user says, I think it's been interesting because most of the people that are posting on there are guys. So looking at the other guys' profiles is just seeing what other guys are doing because I wouldn't know otherwise. And so, yeah, P5 is sort of talking about how he wouldn't have known what to do with his profile, but the subreddits really gave him sort of a window into what other men were doing, and it helped him improve his own profile. And this is very common. So the forums are used to share experience and offer advice, and members would share unappealing interactions, allowing others to learn from mistakes. On to the next category, strategies in gaming. So we found that absent feedback from online dating systems, users devised their own ways, and these ways were achieved through strikingly sophisticated methods, structured experimentation and collecting statistics on return rates for messages, and just sort of general explorations trying to probe the systems and figure out how to make them work. So let's talk a little bit about some of the affordances in OkCupid. This one that's on the screen right now, OkCupid shows a red dot if a user receives a lot of messages and doesn't send very many out. If a user gets a lot of messages or if a user sends out a lot of messages, then their profile dot is green. So it sort of provides a little bit of a window into how active the user is in messaging others. And P2 describes using this in a way to sort of benefit himself, to sort of understand why some men who have red dots, which means that they're not messaging back as frequently as they're getting messages, what they're doing to make their profiles more successful. Because he's assuming that if they're getting a lot of attention and not giving very much back, then they must be successful in the online dating market. And he says that guys who are red dotted on OkCupid are pretty rare. And so what I did is I just went and looked at all of their profiles. And users often spoke of trying to work around affordances in this way. So OkCupid at the time of the study had a system where you could rate someone with stars, and if you gave somebody 4 or 5 stars, they're notified that you're interested. So this means that men didn't have to feel like they had to compose super long, in-depth messages without getting much in return. But P2 spoke of using the feature in an extreme way in order to avoid composing too many unreturned messages. He says he 5-starred literally hundreds of people and talks about his message rate being very high at 50 to 60 new messages a week. And this was pretty common. People would use these features in ways that would benefit them. OkCupid also has a feature that allows notification when an individual has visited your profile. And P8 speaks about trying to see who her female competition is, but she wants to sort of remain invisible and avoid triggering that notification. So she only looks at photographs without clicking through to the actual profile when she searches for people. And finally, we talked a little bit about Tinder's restricted messaging system, where you have to both say that you've liked each other in order to message. And men found this very frustrating. So here, P4, he talks about many men avoided using it in its intended way. So they would, many men would simply swipe right on every single woman in the area, and then they would wait to see who'd match back with them instead of selecting who they were most interested in. So here, P4 sort of talks about how he's matched everyone within 70 kilometers to sort of wait and see who likes him before. Okay, thank you. Okay, so. And then I'm just going to sort of breeze through a few of the other findings. We know there's a lot about antisocial behavior in online dating. People get negative, harassing messages. They feel confused about how to respond, and there's some fears of retribution. And the forums really provided a way to sort of address this in a community-supported method. So I'm just going to read what P8 has to say about how she felt upset and then sought support. She says, I just wanted to get etiquette to see what I should do first about responding to people who I wasn't interested in. And I know that they have FAQs on the sub. She's talking about the subreddit having sort of ways to respond to this, and it's already there. But she says, I decided to post the interaction that I had, the screenshot of the interaction I had with a rude guy that made a message, and then I asked people in the sub, like, is this common? People sought support, they wanted support, and they wanted to sort of get backed up and confirmed that what they were doing was right, and that they weren't alone in receiving harassment. And finally, frustrations with the experience of online dating. People aren't good at describing themselves. There's fake profiles, and people just sort of stop responding when you think you have a connection. Everyone always, people experience frustration with the way that others would sort of talk about themselves and felt as though they weren't really getting very much information out. And many frustrations centered around not understanding the systems themselves. Why aren't people responding? What could I be doing differently? And should I be doing anything differently? Is it me? So in summary, we found that communities can play a big role in helping users learn about site norms on online dating systems, that users wanted to understand online dating systems to the point where they would game systems, try to reverse engineer algorithms, and sort of compare their notes in a way to better understand in a group way. And finally, that communities aren't just about online dating systems, they're about connections, and there's a really deep need for this. So external communities play a really big role in understanding didactic dating systems. And although legitimate peripheral participation and other sort of more standard ways of community participation weren't really present on online dating sites, we found that outsourced communities offered an opportunity for these sort of things to play out. So thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions? No? Okay. Yes.
So you looked at 2 free, anyone can join online dating websites. What about ones that you have to pay, say like
eHarmony, Match.
eHarmony was one I was thinking of, like ones where they actually have like paid psychologists actually match people do research. So do you think people there would be more interested in messaging each other and know more of the field?
Well, I think that's a good question, but in this study, we were sort of interested in exploring this area because it hadn't really been looked at yet, and we felt that sort of comparing those two very different systems was a good way to get started. I think that would definitely be some, like a good area for future work, like how does that change things? Yes?
Out of curiosity, did you guys look into the behavior behind people's motivations to join these online platforms and what they did to manipulate their statistics, or was that not a correlation that was looked at?
So can you rephrase the question?
So I'll be completely honest, a lot of these sites are notorious for people who are very superficial, looking for like, no strings, attachments, and sex. So if these people were motivated to look for sex, for example, and manipulate these algorithms, is there a correlation that I saw, or was that not like that?
I think that's really interesting that people are looking for different things on online dating systems. That wasn't something that we looked at specifically in this study, and I'm not sure if there would be a difference, but it's possible there might be. Yeah. Yes. Did you have a question?
Have you talked to the previous presenter about airport dating?
Yes, we work right next to each other. Yes.
Do you come across just any happenstances of people who actually got together and connected by talking about these dating sites or using them, but using these other forms of community?
Yes, that was actually something that was very interesting, and we talk about it a little bit in the paper. Particularly on the OkCupid subreddit, people who weren't active on OkCupid anymore still were really invested in the community, and they would organize offline meetups pretty frequently. So yeah, it was definitely communities based around the actual online communities rather than just trying to find a date.
We should probably move on
Okay.
to the next presenters. Let's thank Christina again.
All right, thank you.
Hello, my name is Jessica Pater. I'm a third-year HCC PhD student working with Beth Minot in the Everyday Computing Lab. This is a paper that represents 4 years of my life, before I was a student and after I became a student, really just trying to understand youth culture online at a deeper level than we currently do. So, to kind of give you some contributions of the paper up front, this was we surveyed technology use patterns and online behaviors of an understudied population. We described emerging patterns of adolescent social media use. We highlighted initial evidence of understudied behavioral issues within the HCI and social computing communities. And we point to some of the upcoming challenges within our research community related to some of the new social media platforms. So what do we already know? A lot of studies that look at youth culture online focus on a really large age range from 8 to 18. And as you guys all know, a lot happens when you're between 8 and 18. So we get usually these kind of broad, very general studies. From a quantitative standpoint, those are studies like Pew and the Kaiser Foundation that give us a really high-level basic understanding of technology use within teens. So what platforms are they using? Are they using mobile phones? Are they using tablets? What are their levels of access to those technologies as well as levels of access to the internet? And usually they tell us something about the amount of time spent online. And there's a caveat there that we'll get to in the discussion because that's a really interesting point. And usually these study populations, these are your phone calls into the home or electronic surveys, and usually mirror the US population, so they're very generalized. You also have studies that are qualitative in nature, and this is Dana Boyd, Sherry Turkle's work, even one of our own faculty member, Becky Grinter's work. So they really give us these in-depth snapshots of specific foci. So what are communication patterns like within this demographic? How are they adopting instant messaging? So very specific questions within a very targeted demographic and in a very targeted, limited amount of time. So our approach was to understand, are there shifts or changes within these trends, and what do we want to know beyond just this high level? What are some of the motivations and some of the behaviors behind these activities? So we set up a multi-year study with a large urban school system. We actually had multiple middle schools that we focused on. We used a mixed method approach. So we collected surveys, we convened focus groups, and we did direct observation, and we'll get to that in the study design in a second. This was part of a larger annual technology-themed summer camp, so we actually had access to these adolescents, our participants, for 2 full weeks, where multiple different research projects as well as just general technology-based curriculum was taking place. And we focused on an early adolescent population. So these are young individuals that are they've started puberty, but they're not really fully teens, right? They're that 10 to 14 year age range, which, as you can remember from being in middle school, is just a big time in your life when you're going through a lot of behavioral, physical, and kind of psychological change. And this was an NSF-funded effort. So the design of our study, we developed a survey using some of Pew's and Kaiser's validated survey instrument questions, and then some of our own questions that we designed. And we also worked really closely with Georgia Tech facilities and the districts to design the camp, to coordinate how 80 kids were getting from 25 miles away back and forth every day, how they ate, all of that stuff. We then executed the camp and collected data. We analyzed the data, and then for the next year, that data, the findings from that data analysis went in to refine the instruments that we used to collect the data with the campers the following year. So we collected data in June of every year from 2010 to 2013. We had a total of 179 participants. Our median age was about 12 and a half years old, but they ranged anywhere from 10 to 14 years old. So as you can tell, we already kind of are in an ethical, tricky situation, because you have to technically be 13 to use any of these sites if you pay attention to terms of service. We worked with a majority minority population, so most of our students were either African American or Asian. We had a pretty even gender distribution, and the 3 schools that we worked with ranged from 72 to 74% free and reduced lunch rate, which is a way of calculating the poverty levels within that school community. So not the highest in the district. We weren't at like 96%, which I think is the highest rate for the district we worked with, but still really high. So, like I mentioned, we had the students here on campus for 2 weeks in a summer camp. The first day, we deployed the survey so that nothing that they learned or any interactions they had with others kind of tainted their results or kind of masked what was really going on. The survey asked basic demographic information, digital use patterns, kind of what their ideas about platform adoption were, motivation of using technology, and behavioral patterns. And like I mentioned, that this was updated each year to reflect new evolutions in social media and social computing platforms. We waited until the middle of the second week to do the focus groups with the students. This was really deliberate, because in the focus groups, we were asking some potentially very difficult questions about laws that they were breaking, inappropriate, risky behavior they were engaging in. So we spent the week in between that gaining the trust of the students and actually being participants within the camp. We also, during this 2-week process, observed their own personal technology use, because we did not disallow the use of cell phones or tablets or laptops. If they wanted to bring them to camp, they were allowed to bring them. And the focus groups were typically 60 to 90 minutes. We had anywhere from 7 to 13 participants, and they were semi-structured in nature. So I'm just going to give you a couple of the high-level findings. We have a lot more in the paper. But what we found from Access was that pretty much they mirrored the general patterns that we saw in the national surveys. So even though that this is a highly marginalized and highly specialized population, with issues with their socioeconomic status as it compares to the general population, they still had the access to the technology and access to the internet. We had one little blurb here in the home internet use reported, and we don't really have any data to explain why we saw that anomaly. But as you can see here, we saw a drastic uptake in mobile phone usage in 2011, and then in 2013 we saw an extreme amount of smartphones because that's when a new generation of iPhones had come out the year before. So mom's iPhone 4s were now in their hands, and while the parents had their iPhone 5s. So this is another trend that we generally see within this demographic. So how they prefer communicating, and I don't think this should shock anyone, it kind of reaffirms that our population was in line with the larger US-based surveys, that most of these generation prefer texting and social media, where very few phone calls are taking place and even less email. The last 2 years of our camp, none of the participants responded that they emailed. So kind of interesting for all of you people doing incoming freshman stuff for the next few years. So when we look at the digital patterns, this is the time spent online. So in the smaller inner circle, you see that in our first year, we had the respondents tell us that they spent about 3.5 hours a day online. The last year, that increased to about 4.61 hours. But this is where we come back to that caveat. I had seen some of these students online more than 4 hours while they were at camp. And we went back to them in the focus groups and we said, what do you define as being online? What does that mean to you? And they said, well, when I'm on a computer. And I said, so what happens when you're on Facebook on your phone? Well, I'm on my phone. I'm not online. I'm not on the computer. So when we actually talked about, well, if you add up the time that you're spending on your Xbox or PlayStation, talking to people while you're playing games, when you're on your phone talking to people or on the computer, how much time do you think you spend a day? And that's when it increased to 8.31. So a pretty drastic increase from just that 1 year. And I think that leads us to kind of think about how we couch certain things that we're asking of different populations, because what we define as being online is not necessarily what they define as being online. So I'm just going to kind of go through here really quickly. The highlighted just show you that video communications became a huge issue with our students. They really started preferring video chats like UVU and Skype, kind of, but Skype is what their parents use. It's not really what they use to talk to their friends. We also saw a lot of write-ins focused on hyper-local, anonymous social media platforms like Snapchat and Whisper and Confide, as well as people using Snapchat and Kik and Keek. We also saw, the popular media likes to tell us that Facebook is dead, but that's not really what we saw. We saw a continued use of Facebook, and we'll talk a little bit in just a second about why we think that Facebook isn't dead, it's just kind of changing. So this rise in video-based communications, in our second year, we actually had a 31% write-in for the UVU platform, which if you've ever done survey work, having 31 8th graders and 7th graders write in the same thing is pretty amazing. And like I said, no one uses Skype because that's what their parents use. We also saw this kind of bursty nature that we tend to see in social media happening within our population. And the kind of this diversification of their social media platform, they're very sophisticated in the way they use this. And a cyberbullying ring of girls in one of the focus groups told me how they used Keek, Kik, Snapchat, Facebook, and UVU to cyberbully girls systematically within their school during the spring. So they're very well attuned that we know what's going on Facebook and Twitter, so they're diversifying and really stepping up how they maximize their platform usage. And like I said, we saw the emergence of these hyperlocal anonymous apps, and that was only in the last year. And that was typically because no one knows who they are, so they feel like they have greater anonymity, and it's only on their phone, so their parents can't log in on the computer and see what they're doing, which was also a really big plus for them. So within the influences of their behavior, we saw that privacy was something they have no idea what it is. And they think that it should be really against the law for us to be using their social media platforms because they haven't given us access to their information. So something to think about. Also, they're playing with their identity, and I think it was really interesting. We actually had a couple of people talk to us about how they felt trapped in a very religious society or in their community, and they could go on Bebo because none of their friends used that, and they didn't have to be religious. So how they use platforms to differentiate that. And then social pressures. So I'm going to conclude that we saw a drastic decline in the cyberbullying that was being reported, a statistically significant decline, but yet over half were still reporting that they had directly witnessed it. So some issues going around what they're defining as cyberbullying and then what they're reporting to us. We also saw that 88% of our students had sent, received, or had a naked image on their phone within the last 14 days. So our middle schoolers are actively sexting one another and not understanding the legal ramifications of what that could mean. And we actually, in one of the sessions, had a group of girls actively talk about using pro-anorexia and pro-bulimia web forums to help them lose 10 pounds in a week, and what the strategies are of what they called clean living, healthy living, by being able to go from 110 pounds to 100 pounds in a week. And one of their friends in the session said, yeah, right, it's only for track that you did that, and that kind of insinuated this larger conversation. So to wrap up, we've found that the behaviors and some of the motivations behind these platforms are a lot more nuanced and complex than just our general studies show, and that by using these type of mixed methods over a longer duration of time, we can find out really interesting things about what our kids are doing online. So thank you. Questions? Any questions? Yeah?
How did you guys phrase cyberbullying when you were talking to these kids to make them kind of be more honest with you?
So we asked if they had ever been harassed online or they felt that they were being singled out or bullied. So cyberbullying education is a huge component of the public schools now, to where that if you don't report cyberbullying as a teacher, you lose your certification to teach. So it's almost on the level of child abuse or child pornography. So the kids are very understanding of what is cyberbullying, what it means to be a cyber ally, what is cyber harassment. And a lot of the kids responded, if they said that they didn't think it was an issue, that it was just jerks being jerks, and jerks is a acronym here, online, right? So it's not really bullying, but it's just jerks being jerks. But they were responding that no to cyberbullying. So they get that distinction between harassment and bullying. Thanks. Sorry.
So did you look at how much their kids either felt ostracized in their own class group, or like how much communication they had within their groups, and see if they spent more time online or they spent time in certain communities?
We didn't. In the paper, we have a really big graph about which online communities they were a part of, but we didn't go into that depth.
Okay.
Thanks, Jessica.
Thanks.
Hello everyone, my name is Edison Tomas, and I'm a PhD student here as well at Georgia Tech. And I'm trying to get you out of here on time, about 1 p.m. And this is a note, so this is going to be a pretty short presentation as well. It's about food, so it's an appropriate topic for the brown bag. All right, so I suspect that many of you have tried to keep track of what you eat using a number of different mobile applications, and you might have tried to do this for meeting some type of health goal, or maybe you want to lose weight or gain weight. And there are many applications for this out there. MyFitnessPal is perhaps one of the most popular ones. And if you've ever tried to do this, you might know that it's actually quite hard. It's actually not something that is easy and straightforward to do, just because it takes quite a bit of time and there are a number of challenges. And we know this from experience, but also the literature backs this up with there are lots of studies excuse me, lots of studies in the nutritional epidemiology field that talk about the importance of food journaling and also how hard it is. And one of the issues is that people just don't do it for a long period of time. So in this study, which I should say, it's a collaboration between the University of Washington and Georgia Tech. It was a collaboration between these two universities, and it was a great collaboration, by the way. And so in this study, the goal was to really try to understand what these key challenges are. So, and more specifically, why do people really stop food journaling after a while? And so we ran a qualitative study, and there are two parts to the study. One of them was a survey with 141 food journalers. And here are some details on the study itself. So we had 47 active food journalers, 94 food journalers who I guess were no longer actively food journaling, mostly, or at least more biased towards females, and then recruitment through mailing lists and Facebook groups and Fitbit forums, and compensation with Amazon gift cards. And we asked some open response questions. Primarily, what was difficult about the food journaling process, and what are the aspects of food journaling that people dislike the most? So this was one part of the qualitative study, and the second part of it was a content analysis of about 5,000 plus online posts from 3 discussion forums from 3 of these top food journaling applications. One of them was MyFitnessPal, the other one was Fat Secret, and the other one was Calorie Count. And then we just did some content analysis. You can go to these discussion forums, and there's a keyword search field in there, so you can just type in some terms. We started with things like stop logging, and it's not fun to log. And then from those posts that came back, we got some insights for other keywords to use, like tedious and slow and things like that. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to show you some themes here that we found with some quotes from people. Hopefully you get a good sense of our findings, and feel free to read the paper. It's pretty short for more details. So obviously some people stopped because they met their goals, right? So I wanted to lose some weight, I lost some weight. Good, I don't need to log anymore. Some people were interested in learning more about food triggers, and so once they found out what caused some particular reaction that they had to certain kinds of foods, and they identified those, then there was not a need to log anymore. Some of the issues now, so problems related to what was eaten and how much. So not knowing the exact ingredients of what you're eating, and the portions as well were some of the challenges. So you go somewhere to eat and you don't actually know exactly what was used to make that food. So how do you log that? So that's a challenge. So if you've ever used one of these apps, you know that the food database is a big problem, because sometimes you're looking for something, you can't find it, or you find something that's not exactly what you're looking for. So many people talked about this, many of our participants. I relate particularly to the last one here, P1. I just want to log some oatmeal, but there's just the McDonald's oatmeal, there's the Quaker oatmeal, but I just want oatmeal. Yeah? So I found that personally very often, and so some people also identified that as a problem. So losing the habit was one issue as well. So if people start forgetting to do it, they get out of the habit, it's much harder to get back and start doing it again. Once the habit is broken, it's hard to restart. Some issues related to judgment, right? So if you're not eating well, and every time you have to log, it's not positive, over time you end up with this log that's kind of a downer, right? It's all about foods that you're not supposed to be eating. So that also was one of the reasons why people didn't want to keep logging for a long period of time. It wasn't very encouraging. Some people, I thought this comment was actually quite interesting, right? I did not want to obsess about food. Right? So if you have to actually do this task every time you eat, maybe you take some of the joy out of eating away. So negative nudges, this is actually part of the title of the paper. And I think it's really interesting. This is one of the key findings that we got out of this work. In this case, just describing negative nudges as some behaviors that are contrary to goals, right? So for example, it's much easier to log fast foods and prepackaged foods because they already have a barcode. So you can just take a photo of the barcode and you're done. And this led people to eating more of those kinds of things as opposed to perhaps foods that are cooked at home that are much harder to log, right? So obviously that's not what you want, right? The goal is to actually get you to be healthier. That's the point of these tools. Finally here for these negative nudges, maybe people don't want to go out to eat at a friend's house just because they don't know what's going to be served and how it's going to be made. Again, not the kind of thing they would like to encourage ideally. And obviously, if you are going to eat the same things every day, you just need to press one button, and that's all you need, right? I ate French fries, French fries, French fries. Easy, but again, probably the best thing to do in terms of logging, but not what you want to do for your health. And this final quote here, I think it sort of covers this whole space quite well. I think it communicates the issues very clearly. The time it took entering manually made eating fresh and healthy less appealing. Easier to scan a code on some processed stuff and be done with it. And also, social features are quite interesting because there's this very interesting tension. On one hand, some people might feel embarrassed to log certain kinds of foods, but at the same time, people need the encouragement of others. And so on one hand, you might not want to log, but on the other hand, you need to log so that you get the encouragement to keep doing it for a sustained period of time. So my final slide now is just about opportunities here, and the message that I guess we would like to communicate with this paper is that there's a very large design space to explore in food journaling. And traditionally, if you look at the apps, they're about a database and a field where you type in what you ate and you look up the food, and then you get some nutritional content for that. And most of the visualizations and the way that the information is displayed is pretty much standard. But when you look at some of the issues that are causing the challenges with food journaling, there's a very large space that can be explored. So, for example, these apps do not really do a good job exploring routines that people have, right? Some people are vegetarian, they always eat certain things at the same times. So apps can be designed to try to learn that and explore that in an interface to make this process easier. In terms of goals, some people might not actually need all the nutritional information that's provided by these apps. Maybe all they want to do is learn about a food trigger, and so it's not, they don't need to know how much sodium they had for the last month of their lives. You can read the other points. I'll just wrap it up now and open up for questions. And if you guys want to stay a little longer to talk about this, I'm happy to stick around. Okay? Thank you so much.
Understanding users' needs, right? With the results of this paper, how do you think this will change the HSAT researcher approach this problem, food journal problem?
Well, as I said, I think that there are some new ways in which these apps can be designed. Some of them are appearing now. Some of these new apps that are using photos are starting to take advantage of a slightly different approach than simply looking some food up on a database. But the idea is to open up people's minds to the problem and helping them understand that one of the ways to solve the problem is to incorporate people's goals into the application design, and then really understand the problem from a different perspective.